All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you've been enjoying the day so far. For this session, we're going to be covering SAP pen testing, some of the benefits, the reason why to do it, and a quick case study about it. I am Andrew Morris. I'm the Application and Cybersecurity Architect for Turnkey UK. And with me, I'm joined by two guests from Mazars. We have Sandeep, who's a Director of Cybersecurity, and Carm, who's one of the Assistant Managers and Cyber Attack. As I say, we're going to take you through some of the cyber threats and cyber attacks. So why do we do this? What are the current threats out there? Some of the challenges that we experience with SAP and why this solution, why this can help you, or why pen testing can help you. Take you through that case study, and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions and answers. So I'm going to hand over to Sandeep, who's going to take you through some information on cyber attacks.
Thanks, Andrew. So as you can see, last year and this year, we've seen a rise in ransomware attack. So these are just some of the headlines that were reported in the press. But one of the things that we've been actually seeing from last year and this year, part of its response, is more of the human-operated ransomware attacks. They're seen one of the top priority for cyber threats faced by most organizations. These attacks represent a more challenging threat than previous well-known ransomware attacks, such as WannaCry. The human-operated element means that they are skilled, adaptable, financially motivated people behind these attacks who can identify and overcome defenses. These attack groups are increasingly stealing, extracting sensitive data, often posted on the internet or other leak sites to further extort victims, complicating how organizations respond. The attackers use this technique commonly seen in APT intrusion to gain access and spread widely over months and deploy ransomware for maximum impact. So we've seen a lot of this type of attacks from last year and this year. And this is why it's so important to actually make sure your network is secure, which we'll go into a bit more detail in the case study that we performed. Andrew, can you move to the next slide, please? On this slide, I'm going to focus on the kind of the threat actors that we've been dealing with. The hacktivists, yes, they're common of the kind of script kiddies. They're more using the automated tools. They're causing more of the disruption to denial of service to cause disruption. But what we're seeing a lot is the organized crime. This has been quite interesting because the organized crime criminals from last year, because they took advantage of the COVID situation, people working from home, they were attacking a lot of organizations with the aim to deploy ransomware to hold them to ransom, to extort money. And then some of the organization groups, even being paid by the ransomware, deployed all the data they stole on public internet or the underground or the dark net. The other things that we've been noticing is about the insider threat actor. This one has actually been quite interesting for the COVID situation. A lot of employees were actually the criminals. They're the ones who were stealing data internally, and this is where the IT team and SOC team have not been spending their time detecting and monitoring the inside network. And that's one part of our exercises when we do red teaming. We always find we get more wider coverage on the attacks from the insider piece. To you, Andrew.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandeep. So that context is important to understand, some of the threats we're trying to defend against these days. And SAP is a target. For many years, we would pretend it wasn't, or it wasn't important enough. But for most organizations, SAP is the largest application that organizations run, most throughput of money, the processes and everything else. So attackers are now targeting SAP, and there's evidence out there. The challenge with it, though, is that SAP is complex and misunderstood by many people across the business. Unlike other applications, it's not a SaaS software just sitting on the internet. It's a web server, it's an application. There's integration with hundreds of different pieces of other technology and applications. There's databases and hosts. And all of that means it has a very large attack surface, which people can take advantage of. It also means it can be incredibly hard to try and defend and against all these moving parts. As a result, a lot of wider security teams, so focused outside of SAP, don't always understand the application or the risks. It can just be put in that bucket of another application. where that's not necessarily the case for most organizations. And as a result, it's hard to define, what makes SAP secure in our organization. Is it secure, and how do we measure that? For many organizations itself, who even defines what is secure is the challenge. SAP security teams traditionally focus more on the end users up in the application layer, with governance, risk and compliance, and access roles, identity and access management, which makes sense because that's where the largest amount of risk comes in from a legislative or regulating fraud point of view. The application owner themselves might not even understand security or roles in the slightest. They are finance-based. They understand the segregation of duties and SOX and the other compliant elements, but certainly not some of the wider challenges. And the team, with all of the other wider security tools, vulnerability management, patching, SIEM tools, security operations center, that's often under a different wing under the CISO. And because of the complexities and the misunderstandings, they don't always talk the same language and understand how those tools can apply to SAP. And the SAP teams don't always have the knowledge to understand how those tools should be applied to SAP. So one of the ways that pen testing can help with this is, if you've been doing this for as long as many of us, you've probably already tried pen testing of SAP in the past, or discussed it or considered it. I know many years ago, when I first started, the pen testing was still largely, a couple of guys would turn up on your site with their own laptop, connect directly to SAP and try and compromise it, and it was as effective as your security at that time. But what it missed was that wider context, which we can now get through more of a red teaming blend of pen testing, where we get to test scenarios and understand SAP in the context of the wider network and the wider security controls. So, for example, are they moving in? Can they even get onto the network in the first place? Is the monitoring in place to detect these attacks as they move from across the VPN to the across the network onto the servers and into SAP? That's what traditional pen testing has often mixed. Because pen testing these days, it uses there's derived frameworks which we can use and leverage. We're using real methods. We're using real attacks that all the threat actors that Sandeep highlighted use. So it's the same types of attacks, the same methods, the same advanced techniques, which ultimately gives us our real risks to understand what is actually the risk here. Is it that our employee might get phished and lose their credentials, and then they're used to compromise SAP? Is it that pre-production system connected to the internet, or another SAP component compromised another way, lost devices, or the list goes on, or malware? So doing pen testing helps you test real life scenarios against your real life network rather than just SAP in isolation. And as a result of this, it helps you identify your compensating controls. So with SAP, SAP release monthly patches for security releases, patch and update now. Not every organization is able to do those. They're not able to patch and remediate vulnerabilities instantly. Downtime isn't instantaneous. It often has to go through lengthy procedures, and testing can be a real challenge, especially if in the common scenario that pre-production only has half the interfaces that production has, or half the interfaces about anyway, where suddenly making a change to how connections are intercepted and processed can have a real knock-on impact on your business if it's not tested thoroughly, and many organizations don't have that capability. And of course, by understanding how a real attacker would get to SAP over the network or another method, it helps you prioritize that remediation. Yes, there's always going to be the recommendation of keep on patching, perform vulnerability assessments, and all the other good practices such as locking down users and everything else. But in terms of understanding what you need to address first and what order, pen testing can really help drive those requirements. Understand if you can stop the attack before it even emerges, as an example, or by stopping them entering your network. So there's some real strong benefits to why modern pen testing techniques really work. And just to bring some of them to light, I'm going to hand over to Carm, who's going to take us through a recent case study that we did with a customer.
Thanks, Andrew. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start just by setting the scene a little bit of what we're doing and how we're going to do it. So as Andrew said, this was a red team engagement for a client. And the benefit of it being a red team is that it's not just about those technical controls, it's also about people and procedures. How are we detected? And are staff doing what is expected of them? Are the behaviours of staff in a secure manner? So one of the key points with this as well is that your IT team is not aware. So the SOC, the Security Operations Centre, isn't aware that we're going to be undertaking this exercise. As you can see, the objectives were set by the client. Those are the objectives they are concerned with. How are we able to execute malware? Would we be able to access the SAP application? And once on it, will we be able to increase our privileges up to administrator level? In order to meet these objectives, we discussed two scenarios that were taken forward. The first one is known as an assumed compromise. And with an assumed compromise, we are given a laptop by the client. It's a laptop that is a standard build for any person within that organization. And it is there to simulate a user that has already been compromised by a phishing campaign. So what we do is we skip that initial stage rather than trying to do the reconnaissance, scrape email addresses from places such as LinkedIn and phish those users. We go straight to a laptop that already has standard access, and from there we try to exploit and move throughout the network as a user who had access to the system. The second scenario is an external attack. Could a user or an attacker attack the SAP network externally by exploiting technical vulnerabilities, security misconfigurations? So we're looking at servers themselves, but also the web application as well. So two different attack scenarios that are testing two different parts of the client's organization. Next slide, please. So the way in which we undertake these red teams is we use an attack chain. We use an attack chain that maps an APT. So an APT is Advanced Persistent Threat. They are groups that are monitored and mapped by security organizations. And for this particular example, we used one known as Wizard Spider. Now, that is a real threat group. And the reason we chose this particular threat actor is because of the way in which they move through a network. We were able to replicate their genuine techniques across the attack map, as you can see in front of you. Now, there are many different ways which you could be attacked. The light boxes are methods that were not used during the exercise, whereas the dark boxes are the methods that were used to move from one stage through to the end. So, as we said, we started on the persistence with the account already on the laptop, skipping that external attack. So we start to move through, avoiding the security controls, avoiding antivirus, and moving through the networks as we go. So this particular attack path was chosen, as I mentioned, because it's for a large corporation. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what I want to take us through is the timeline of how we undertook the attack. And we're going to focus on our attack at the top first, and then map that against the Security Operations Center underneath. So the first few days, we have this laptop. We are browsing the network. We are seeing if there are any shares open to everyone. We are looking to see what kind of tools we could run, and just trying to see whether or not there are any kind of easy wins. In the first few days, it's pretty quiet. However, as we move forward through the engagement, by the end of the week, we found that there was a tool that could be used. It was found in a share. It was able to be accessed by anyone, and it allowed us to increase our privileges on our laptop ourselves to be able to run any software. And that's specific to our laptop, to the client's laptop. From that point, we're able to run tools that enumerate shares. We're able to start to run some exploitations that give what's known as curve roasting, and that gives us an ability to dump passwords and credentials to see where we could move further through the attack chain. As we continue on, we are now in a position where we run these tools. We've gathered some additional credentials. Those credentials allow us to move further into the network. As we move further into the network, we deploy our malware. We have two different kinds of malware. We have a common one known as Cobalt Strike, and we have our own internal one that's been internally developed. And we run both of those in case one gets detected, we have a backup. So you run your malware. Your malware allows you to continue to pivot throughout the network, finding additional information which you can exploit, such as company information, IP, financial data. It also allows you to discover additional users. When we have those additional users, you can then pivot further onto the network. And as we go through the exercise, by day 11, we're on a number of different servers. Those different servers give us access to a variety of information. As we've got that information, we can then start to analyze it. What information do we have? How far can we push our access? And are we able to pivot further and further, finding even more information? So now we're towards the end of the exercise. We can compare where we are to the reactions of the SOC, so the Security Operations Center. So the first alert came through to us that we had been detected was on day 9. So by day 9, we had obviously already been on the network for 9 days. Our initial compromise had occurred 5 days previous when we had increased our privileges on the laptop. So that's already 4 days where potentially we were doing increased damage on that network. Obviously, we don't actually damage, it's simulated, but it's showing that there's a delay between the point where the attack occurs and the response of the SOC team. As you can move forwards, you see that when our ransomware and our malware was activated on the network, there was still no response from the SOC. So where we executed our malware on the servers and not our local laptops, actually there was no response from the SOC. Where the SOC had responded was on the laptop, the client laptop, and when that had been detected, they very quickly shut down that laptop and removed access, and we had to turn our hands up and go, hey, we're really sorry, we are here, we're allowed to be here, can you let us carry on? Once we had continued moving on and they were aware we were there, but still acting as if we were a threat and just looking for some of our actions, what we found was it still took a while for those reactions to come through. So where we were on different servers using different accounts, the compromised accounts that we had found through our exploitation, those responses didn't come through until day 50. Again, by which point we had already been on a variety of different servers for 4 days. Next slide, please. So what we'd like to highlight during that kind of exercise is that purple teaming is a really good example of how that could work, because there were some really good actions undertaken by the SOC. And by sitting with a SOC as part of a red team, we consider this concept of a purple team. And the purple team is the red team and the blue team sitting beside each other, tweaking the response. So as we said, some of the key strengths, there was really good monitoring on the endpoints of the users' laptops. When we were detected, we were shut down and we were isolated from the domain. But it's that time. And it's the time delay between being detected and then actually being removed from the network. While we had found passwords, actually the passwords are shown to be really strong passwords. The weakness was that they had been found in shares where users hadn't been securing them safely. So the benefit that the organization had here was they were using multi-factor authentication. That was using both CyberArk, but also an application where you had to generate a token in order to log into things. So there are some mitigations in place that enable those weaknesses to be not so severe as maybe they could be. Again, where the SOC and the red team work really well is by tweaking that response. So why hadn't the malware been detected on the endpoints that weren't the laptops, where the servers were a little bit less monitored than the laptops themselves? So again, it's about highlighting the benefits of what has gone well with the SOC but also where there is improvement in the people and the processes. So what we were able to show is that we were able to get onto the network. We could do some work without being detected. And although we weren't able to elevate our privileges on the SAP environment, we were able to navigate around the different servers, find credentials, and then use those different credentials to be able to access those environments. So it's a good example of both where there are strengths, but also where there are weaknesses as well. And what we had from the two different scenarios is that during the engagement, there could be real serious financial and reputational damage. However, with threat actors, they have time. And with our engagement, we have limited time, and we're able to highlight the benefits and both where there could be improvements as well. Back to you, Andrew.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Just some of the key takeaways, and to recap some of those points. Hopefully you saw through that case study that it really helps you understand what your risks actually are, helps you prioritize where to spend your budget. You know, in the end, some of the threats that, this case study is a good example, some of the risks that they thought were present turned out not to be the main risks at all in the end. It wasn't necessarily attacks directly on SAP systems connected to the internet or compromised credentials, but instead, given some of the issues found with the laptops and everything else, there was a real risk of a lost device being compromised, and as Carm said, an attacker having that length of time on the network or on the device to have more time to explore and understand how they can circumvent some of the controls. So as a result of that, it really helps you drive that prioritization of where should you be spending that money. Is it investing in better cyber defenses for SAP, extending existing tools to cover SAP, or even fine-tuning some of those controls? And even if you're at the point where you don't have any of these tools yet, you don't have a SOC, there's no SIEM, your patching is non-existent, and vulnerability management doesn't happen, these types of exercises are still incredibly useful just to understand where you should be starting. Because obviously, if an attacker can punch a hole through your network and reach SAP, then that's a good place to start because it endangers your entire organization, not just the application. So regardless of where you are on that journey, it's always worth considering just to understand what your risks actually are and how if they can be exploited. We found out that it brings teams together, finds a common language, regardless of whether if it's a CFO who owns SAP or another person in finance or the application security team or the CISO. They all talk risk, ultimately, at the end of the day. They all understand the concept of SAP going offline or being compromised or the data stolen. They just do it in different ways. And so by introducing this concept and showing the big picture of where everything sits, how it works, how it's interconnected, and some of those attack chains and pass through SAP and through the network, it helps break down some of those silos and gets teams talking and understanding how they can monitor additional applications or what else could be in place. And these are customizable. The scenarios set there were by the customer. Other times they ask for our help in defining what is the likely risks for them based on their size, industry, and other factors. You can be as targeted as you want or wide in general. The only variable there is just how much time do you have and what you'd like us to achieve. But it's infinitely customizable regardless of your size, your scale, or even your own maturity. And it helps for me, that old argument of we don't need to patch SAP or worry about SAP. It's sitting in the middle of our core network. Nobody can touch it. This helps disprove or prove that statement. If somebody can still get to SAP directly over the network or a compromised device, then it does need to be addressed. And it's expandable, as Carl mentioned. Pentesting, purple teaming is normally a good follow-up that many people look at, where they can see what they detected or failed to detect and try and tweak those controls in real time in conjunction with the attackers, just to fine-tune what can be captured. Or if an SAP vulnerability is exploited, patching that and trying again. Obviously, you don't normally try and patch real-time in production, but it can be simulated in other environments such as development or pre-production. So purple teaming is a very common one. And it often try repeated attempts from different angles, different methods, or they used spider wizard, the chain there, but you might select a different one if your cyber threat intelligence has identified a different threat actor after you. So there's lots of room for movement. I'm just gonna pause now for any questions. I can see 2 in the chat already. But if you do have one, feel free to type it in and we can answer it in a moment. The first one that came in was one of the common problems we have on pen testing is that the pen testers keep citing the OWASP top 10 issues on how SAP secure the system, but SAP deny the risks exist. Does this service help, or how can we help reduce those false positives? Karma, Sandeep, is that something you've had experience with in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, with OWASP has its place. It's a good way of identifying kind of the low-hanging fruits, but the way things are moving forward is the attackers are getting smarter, they're getting clever, they're using more advanced tools. And that case study that Con just talked about, it's using kind of, if you're using the real life kind of techniques for using the MITRE framework, you can work out not only what controls you've got placed around the SAP itself, but what the supporting infrastructure as well. That's what the attackers are going after. So if they find a weakness within the operating system, we will try to exploit. If they get the domain admin or the DA or privileges, you can just log into the SAP system and then you've got full rights. So OWASP has its place, but this type of work of testing is more realistic, it's more real. And this is what the threat actors are doing right now.
I think one of the key things to add to that is it's about testing those OWASPs. It's all well and good saying, oh, this is a risk and it's come as a risk. Whereas what we're trying to show is actually, yes, that maybe have been detected, but was it exploitable? It's taking it that one stage further to say it's not just a test. Actually, we want to see if we can really get that access. Because some of these things, yes, they are risks, but they are risks in theories. We did a test recently for a client, and in theory, one of the patches was missing, made them vulnerable. But actually what we found out is there were no current exploits for it. Because of the way in which the system had been configured and hardened, we weren't actually able to use that vulnerability in a way that was a realistic threat to gain access onto the SAP system. So we highlighted it, that it was there, but it wasn't, we told them, we were honest, you have a patching problem. However, as you currently stand, this is not something that leaves you at risk because there is no publicly known vulnerability. And that's the key point. It's publicly known versus, again, we talked about those different threat actors. A nation state may well have an exploit for it, but somebody working on what is currently available in the public domain wouldn't have been able to get access. And I think that is a very clear difference as well.
No, absolutely. A great point. And there's not going to be many SAP systems out there without any vulnerabilities. It's such a complex beast of different moving parts, different versions, different releases, different environments, that something is going to be missing somewhere for very practical reasons in most cases. So it's reducing those false positives by actually testing to see if they're exploitable, if it is an issue to worry about, or if it does need your attention. Perfect. Can the business define their own scenarios for pen testing to specifically target their risks? For example, PCI, GDPR, data breaches? Yes, it's a short answer on that one. I think, the scenarios that you define can be pretty much any target. That end goal of what can the attacker achieve is probably going to be the key, or one of the key steps for you there. Is the result them stealing all your information and publishing it on the internet? Is it compromising GDPR, stealing credit cards? And each of those different scenarios would lead to different methods of attack, different approaches. Understanding where the data sits, is it tokenized in one place, in its raw format in another? not necessarily targeting, always targeting the weakest part, trying to gain that quickest route through to achieving the goal. So yes, in my eyes, they're absolutely valid scenarios. Anything that can be added there?
No, I totally agree with that one, because it's more realistic if the client is defining those kind of scenarios. It's basically what keeps them up all night. What would be their concern if an attacker did get in? So aligning the scenarios what the clients has come up with is actually what makes it more interesting for us. The kind of the attack techniques that we were describing. You've got your insider threat, your assumed compromise, you've got your external attacker trying to get in, ultimately the objectives and the scenarios, if it's been defined by the client itself or the organization, we basically, it makes it more realistic.
Yeah, I think it's about making it useful as well. If we define what we think is relevant to you, actually the client may not have the same view, and making sure that we work as a team to develop those scenarios that are realistic, and what we think are the crown jewels for an organization aren't necessarily the same. So having that targeted scenarios, what they're concerned about, is definitely useful.
Yeah. Well, a good question has just come in on that very topic. So if, based on our results and experience, what would we say are the top 3 things that companies should be focusing on to better secure themselves?
I would say definitely the monitoring detection. So on this particular case study, what we found was quite interesting. While the SAP environment was segregated, while trying to get to the SAP environment, yes, there were monitoring in place for certain different parts of the network. But as soon as we reached the SAP environment, that's when we went completely off grid for the SOC team. That's when they didn't even know we were on the SAP environment at that point. So from a client perspective, you need that monitoring, doing all of these simulations to make it current as well. So you're always making sure your IT team or your SOC team are up to date and they actually know how the tools have been configured as well. And this is what we were describing about the purple team. Having red team and purple team, the blue team working together, do that purple team assessment, it will help improve how the SOC detects and respond to a cyber attack.
And just before we move on to another point of the top 3, I think it's worth adding there that's where that integration between teams comes absolutely critical. The SOC and the people defining those use cases for monitoring might not necessarily understand how SAP can be attacked, or the moving parts, or how it can be exploited. And the SAP team might not necessarily understand how that could be formed into a use case. So that integration at that point and breaking down the silos is critical, so they can understand if attacks they're seeing on the network could be a precursor to an attack on SAP, and vice versa. If something is being attacked on SAP at a certain point in that chain, that means more than likely there's another indicator they've missed somewhere, that they've already breached a network device or something else. So having everybody having involved in those discussions is key on that one.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with a slightly different one for my point, and that would be the generic user themselves. One of the things we found during our example was the amount of people that had stored passwords in text files in shares, and that's not something that's always picked up in pen tests. Is what are the users doing? Are they protecting themselves in a way in which they're thinking about someone that's already breached the network, and where are they storing those credentials? That it's less of it's still a security control, but it's not the security goal we think of in terms of protecting the network and the patching and the responses. It's about how users are working in a day-to-day basis, and I think that's a very interesting part of the security piece that we all know we shouldn't be, I should say, storing our passwords in text files or folders or in spreadsheets. We should be using password managers and secure single sign-on. And actually, where is that going in a whole organization post-breach if our users aren't necessarily educated?
So in summary, monitoring, education, and more simulations.
Well, I'm gonna throw a third one in of doing the basics, the hygiene, the configuration of systems and managing vulnerabilities, so patching and everything else. Many organizations still don't do it. And with SAP, it's good reason. But typically, you know, the infrastructure SAP is running on, if you manage it yourself, you know, and that includes the cloud estates it might be hosted on. The updates need to be there, the patches need to be applied. And if organizations struggle with that, there's tools and services available to help you automate, especially with SAP. You know, where there's so many different versions and components that just looking at the release notes, it's hard to understand sometimes if that actually applies to your systems. But there's help out there to get it done, to help you review it and keep on top of that, because ultimately the more vulnerabilities are closed down, there's less opportunity for an attacker who might have more time on their hands than a dedicated pen testing engagement. Let's see, we've got lots of questions coming in, which is good. We already conduct pen testing, but I don't know if SAP is being covered with the real scenarios you described. How can I ensure that these scenarios are being completed? For me, that's confirming the scope and checking the scope of those engagements. What objectives have been set? Do they involve SAP? And just understanding what is trying to be achieved. You know, when they say, you know, these are our goals and our targets, what are they going for? How does SAP integrate with that? Anything to add?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. It's defining a, you know, it's setting, just say, right, I just want a pen test. You have to be specific, right? What systems are you concerned about? What particular areas? You know, we spoke about those crown jewels, and if your crown jewels is the data that's contained within your SAP system, then that's what we will target. Yeah. And when we give you a report at the end of it, it should be very clear on, you know, when we set the scope of the document, you're concerned with SAP, and this is how it responded. So definitely setting up that key scope and very, very specific what the bits you want to target, I think is key there.
Yeah, because I mean, if the SAP is the key focus, to get to the SAP environment, we will find vulnerabilities to get to that environment, and you will have an understanding where the other additional issues are on the network. But the key focus, if your priority is we need our crown jewels is the SAP environment, that will be our target. That's our objective to go after. We did a red team once where we were given a wide scope, and they were saying, right, see what you can do on the network. Yeah, of course, right at the end, domain admin, once you got that access, it's game over. But what we found was we got to the SAP environment, we logged in, we had full rights to that, and we could start making false payments. So we start to see invoices, we start to see HR information, all this kind of stuff, which actually the organization didn't think about. Their focus was, if someone gets to domain admin, that's my concern. But when we showed them the results from the SAP environment, saying, look what we found, they went, actually, that was more of a worry than someone trying to get into the domain admin, because your attacker, they're not going to go for the domain admin, because as soon as they try to touch that environment, if you've got monitoring in place, it's game over. So it's easy for them to go to the other parts of the network, and SAP's probably a thing we've been noticing. It's less focused. People don't actually think about, have certain monitoring set up or focus around the attack scenarios around the SAP environment. So that was quite an interesting test that we worked together with Andrew's team and ourselves when we were doing that SAP environment. It was you know, we found good results on that one.
Absolutely, and that ties back to what we said earlier about understanding the real risk. We're just coming up to the end here, but I want to try and squeeze as many more questions in as we can. If you don't understand your IT assets or services, how can we effectively scope a pen test? Now, for me, you know, if you lose like the NIST pillar, that first starter part of identifying what you have in your estate, you know, with the change management database or equivalent, that is a critical part of any defense strategy. If you do not know what you are trying to defend, again, what you're trying to, if you haven't identified all your assets, you have no chance of protecting, defending, or responding or recovering them. So yes, that is absolutely a critical part that you should ideally have in place anyway. But even without that knowledge, it is still possible to scope some of those pen tests, you know, understand what you have in place. And it's not, from my experience anyway, it's not too uncommon to as part of pen tests, discover assets you didn't know exist that were connected, systems connected to the internet that you didn't believe were, old servers you thought were long decommissioned, which can be used by attackers to jump onto various things. So asset management is not a requirement for pen testing, but it's certainly a recommendation for operating an effective security model. This one in 4 minutes or less. It was mentioned in an earlier session that we could be generally but not specifically protected when assessed against MITRE. What is the difference and how do we secure ourselves better?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So in an earlier session today, it was discussed that you could be generally protected when assessed against MITRE, but not necessarily specifically protected. So it doesn't necessarily cover all aspects. What's the difference between being specifically protected and generally protected, and how can organizations secure themselves better?
So if I get the question, cool. So generally protecting yourself using MITRE is a really good framework, because it's basically replicating what a threat actor will do. It's a different pathway to get to the end objective. Now, doing red teaming simulation, we will cover quite a lot of that MITRE framework, but a purple team really comes into play here, because we're using that playbook, we're using the MITRE framework and using all the techniques possible in that MITRE framework, but working with the blue team, understanding of are the tools being set up correctly, and are the fine-tuning, which is basically detect all those different techniques and stopping them. So, for example, if it's a spear phishing campaign, we can use that from a MITRE framework and then sit with the SOC team and say, did you detect that? No, right, fine-tune your tool sets. Then we replicate that again. All right, you've blocked it. So that's what we tend to use for MITRE.
I think as well, it also ties into that very specific, you've got general risks and threats with insecurity, such as malware outbreaks, versus that very different threat of an APT is out to target you. And I think the question's also around that. So it's that difference between, is there a real person on the other end of this who is targeting you, gunning for your systems, your servers, your data, or whatever their target might be, versus a user has randomly stumbled across the phishing email which went to 4 million people this morning, and that leads to a malware outbreak. MITRE is designed more for the former, with a dedicated attacker. Am I correct?
Yep.
But that doesn't mean it's necessarily useless against that more specific and general threat. The techniques or approaches, or just some of the exploits they try and perform will still be done by more automated methods and these general risks, as it were. And having those multiple defense in depth and layers, monitoring, CMDBs, and all the other security elements which are recommended will all help ultimately defend you regardless of where that attacker comes from.
That's right.
Excellent. I think we are at our limit of time. So I'm going to pause there. But if you do continue to have questions, our contact details are at the back of this slide, which will be shared and is available. So feel free to reach out with more questions. I'm always happy to discuss this stuff for days at a time. But if I can move the slide on. Technical challenges, there we go. Please stay tuned. There is another session coming up, which is a final session of the day with Richard Hunt, who's going to take us through a webinar panel on is the problem in the chair or the computer. But from us, Sandeep, Khan, thank you very much for your time, and to the audience, thank you very much for joining us and getting involved with all those questions. It's appreciated. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.